Hello everyone, my name is Cavan, and today I'll be doing a motion analysis on the motion This House Regrets Society's emphasis on university qualifications. The theme for this round is education, and this was round two, I believe, of the Noya Debate Championships 2023. So before we discuss the different arguments that you can run on the government team and the opposition team, I think it's a bit useful to do a bit of contextualization so that we understand what this motion is actually about. So the first thing that I think requires a bit of disambiguation or a bit of definition is what the society's emphasis means. Because if you think about it, it's actually a bit vague and ambiguous what society's emphasis means. Like, in what way does society emphasize this? So I think one of the first questions I would ask when receiving a motion like this is to try to think about what this emphasis means and what it looks like, and try to think of examples to ground the understanding of society's emphasis in the real world, right? So think of how this manifests in your everyday life. So one way in which we can begin to start thinking about this emphasis is to perhaps reflect on our own lived experiences, reflect on our own social interactions, um, and think of how this manifests in our daily interactions as well. So perhaps this looks like in the realm of education, when a lot of our teachers will tell us that it's very important for us to get to university, where the end goal of education appears to be for us to get into university. Maybe that's one way in which the emphasis manifests. Perhaps another way that the emphasis manifests is in the family dynamics. So when your parents pressure you or they tell you to go to university, when you go to like family gatherings and your relatives ask you like, oh, what university do you plan to apply to? Those are perhaps subtle ways in which society indicates that there is an emphasis or an importance for university qualifications. Um, but maybe the most direct way in which society emphasizes university qualifications is in the realm of employment, in terms of job opportunities, where if you are a university graduate, you are statistically more likely to get a higher pay or even just more likely to gain employment in the first place. So the emphasis um, is a kind of social narrative, and they manifest in very different ways. They manifest perhaps in more direct ways in the ways in which you're able to get a job and the pay you get when you get the job, but also it maybe manifests in more interpersonal ways, more subtle ways, like the conversations you have with your friends, the conversations you have with your family, the very subtle and invisible pressures that you perhaps are not aware of until you actually think about it and reflect about it. So that gives us at least some understanding and some illustration of the place that this narrative has in society. And we have at least oriented what this emphasis looks like so that we have a better understanding of the outcomes. The reason why it's always important to define these very ambiguous terms is because all of the outcomes in this debate are derived from this emphasis, right? If you think about this debate from a very simplistic standpoint, it's about whether this emphasis is good or bad. And before we can start discussing the outcomes, we must first discuss the cause, right? You must think about what is the specific narrative that we're discussing and whether it leads to those good outcomes or whether it leads to those bad outcomes. So a lot of teams will often just jump straight into argumentation. They'll give like a whole list of why this is bad, or let's give a whole list of why this is good without actually defining what the emphasis looks like in the first place. So very important for us to start asking very basic questions first, just to contextualize the debate so we have a common and better understanding of what this emphasis looks like. So think of this almost like a narrative debate. So whenever you receive a narrative debate, you probably want to think of what are the ways in which this narrative manifests. This motion doesn't explicitly have the word narrative in it, but in a way, so the society emphasizing university qualifications is a kind of social narrative because it's saying that university qualifications are important. So if I were to reword it slightly, this house regrets the narrative that university qualifications are important. You can see there are some degrees of similarities here and why there's a need for us to explain and define what this narrative looks like. So that's the first aspect of contextualization. The next thing, also part of setup, would be to discuss the counterfactual. So you probably have heard this 1,000 times, either from your coaches or from judges, that all regrets motions requires a counterfactual. The reason is because the nature of regrets motions are retrospective in nature. So regret motions, much like the emotion of regret, right, requires you to reflect on something that happens in the past and wish that something else happened instead. So that something else happened instead is the counterfactual part of the debate, right? If you did not want this emphasis, you would imagine that the absence of the emphasis would have led to something else instead. So that's the examination of the counterfactual part of this debate. All debates are comparative in nature. You're comparing two things. Uh, if you are saying that you don't like this emphasis, it has to be compared to something else. There is no explicit comparative in this debate. So it requires us to construct the counterfactual for if we did not like this emphasis, what do we think would have been preferable instead of this emphasis? So that's why the counterfactual is important. Now, in terms of thinking of the counterfactual, I think there are two things that you want to think about in this debate. So the first is, in the absence of emphasizing university qualifications, would different things have been emphasized instead? So if employers are no longer looking for university qualifications, they still need to evaluate candidates on some metric. They still need to hire candidates. So would they perhaps look to other criteria or other measurements um, to consider candidates, right? To prioritize candidates. Would this perhaps be job experience, internship experience, right? Personality. Those maybe are the other things that would have been emphasized in the absence of university qualifications instead. So I think what you need to do here is to imagine how the job market and how the employers would react in a world where they suddenly didn't think that university qualifications were that important. What else would they think would have been important instead? So that's the first aspect of the counterfactual. What else would have been emphasized instead? Or perhaps nothing else would have been emphasized instead, right? The other part of the counterfactual is how will people view university education? Because even in a world where there wasn't an emphasis on the importance of university qualifications still exist, right? Like universities and university education and degrees and qualifications, all of these things still continue to exist in the counterfactual. The motion doesn't give the proposition team or the government team the fiat to say that universities don't exist, right? This is not this house regrets universities. This motion is this house regrets the emphasis on university qualifications. So given that university qualifications still exist, if we did not think that it was important, if we did not emphasize it, then what would be our perception of university qualifications? And I think that's another question you want to consider as well. We'll discuss the answer to all of these questions later when we are discussing the arguments, but this is the grounding of the counterfactual and how we should start thinking of the counterfactual. So before we talk about the case for the government and the opposition, just some quick things to consider. The first thing is, generally for all debates, I think it's very important for us to not jump into arguments. It's very important for us to first illustrate and construct the world that we are debating in. This is especially for narrative motions or like society's emphasis motions, where what we are debating about actually can be quite ambiguous. There actually can be a great disparity between what one team thinks is emphasis and what the other team thinks is emphasis, right? Like one team could think that emphasis means simply that university education is important. Another team could think that society's emphasis means that university education is essential. Like you have to get to university and you have to get a degree. So there isn't actually much, there might not be much parity between what one team thinks is the emphasis and what the other team thinks is the emphasis. Same for narrative debates, right? One team might think a narrative manifests in this way, another team might think a narrative manifests in a different way. And so, given that all of the outcomes and the arguments you're running in the debate are derived from what the narrative causes, it's very important to first define the narrative or the emphasis. So yes, pay extra attention to causality, that society's emphasis is the thing leading to the impact that you're claiming. But also the other very important thing to consider is that debates don't happen in a vacuum. So we live in a world where many different narratives exist, where there are perhaps different or competing narratives about university qualifications. So one could make the argument that we are now living in a world where university education is kind of like de-emphasized, right? So maybe there are a lot of stories about people who are very successful with just a diploma or with no diploma or no degree. So maybe we could make an argument that it's like there's like a coexisting emphasis on like real world skills and interpersonal skills and soft skills, and there's perhaps like a pushback against like university qualifications. So that's the very tricky thing about social norms and social narratives, which is that many different social narratives and many different things are emphasized in society at once. These things could be competing, they could be contradictory. So it's very important for us to not debate in just a vacuum where we are only looking at this one very narrow aspect of society that emphasizes university qualifications, but to look at a more macro view, have like a bird's eye view of society and all the different narratives that exist within our society, all the different social norms that we have, all the different social attitudes and perspectives that we have about university education, or about just social norms in general. Okay, so this concludes the setup portion of the debate. At this point, we generally have like a decent understanding or illustration of what this emphasis looks like, the way it manifests, and we have some inkling of the counterfactual that we'll be constructing later. So let's first start off with the government team and the arguments that they can construct. So when thinking of arguments in this debate, there are two main like jumping pads that you can use. So the first is to think of who are the people that this emphasis affects, right? Think of the different groups of people and their characteristics. So maybe one group of people could be pre-university students. Maybe another group of people could be minorities or disenfranchised groups. So the thing about social narratives, the thing about social emphasis is that they obviously affect different groups very differently because they are in different places in life, they have access to different resources. And so it's very important for us to realize that these social narratives and these social emphasis don't affect people homogeneously. They affect people very differently in very varied ways. They're internalized in very different ways, and they affect people to different extents. So that's the first thing to think of, right? The different groups in this debate. And the next thing to think of is maybe the more causal aspect of the debate, right? Which is given that this narrative exists, how does it have real world impacts, right? Like how does it affect the choices that people make? How does this affect the way that people perceive one another? How does this affect the way people perceive themselves? So after we have categorized the different groups that are in this debate, after we have thought of the different ways in which the different groups interact with this narrative and are affected by this narrative, we can think of how this affects the choices that they make, the way that they view themselves, and the way that other people view them. So that is some questions that we can begin to think about before we start building our arguments. Okay, now for the government case. So one of the first groups of people we can think about are people that are not in university yet. So in the context of Singapore, this might be your polytechnic students or your junior college students before they enter university. And so I think there are a few things to consider here. The first is that there is an immense amount of pressure put on them to enter university, which is probably not a good thing. So many people who eventually end up in university are not there because they're genuinely passionate about furthering their education. They're not there because they genuinely think that this will improve their lives or because they think that this would significantly make them much more enriched. A lot of them are just doing this because society has emphasized this, because it's a norm, because their parents told them it was important, because their teachers told them it was important, because everyone else in their life is also going to university, right? And saying that this is a very important thing that you must do, that university qualification is extremely important. So the first thing you might want to contextualize is that the outcome of emphasizing something so much by saying something is super important, that something so vital, something so integral, is that it creates a kind of coercive pressure for many people who are not in university yet to just apply anyways. Almost a kind of path dependency, if you think about it, where they just follow this route that society has carved out for them because it's a social norm. The next question you want to think about under this is, why is coercion bad? Right? Why is pressure bad? Because if you just stop the argument at, oh, they are pressured to go to university, the opposition has an angle here to flip this on you by saying, well, they're pressured to do something that benefits them in the future. They're pressured to do something that might enrich their lives, that might allow them to be equip them with more skills, make them more employable. So why is this the bad thing? So we need to explain why coercion is ultimately something that's bad. So the first, perhaps very trivial reason is that this is something that's incredibly expensive. Um, Many people end up taking student loans. They are burdened with this crippling and colossal debt because they've taken like huge amounts of loans in order to pay off this university education. That's perhaps like one angle that we can look at. Another angle that we can look at, perhaps slightly more relatable, is that many people end up in university, but they're not studying things that they enjoy. So the typical degree is like 3 to 4 years, and this 3 to 4 years of their life is incredibly miserable because they are just doing something that they were told to do. Maybe they're studying a degree they're not really passionate about, they're not really inclined to do, but they felt like they had to do it anyways, um, just because society told them that this was something that was so important. So perhaps in the counterfactual, where this emphasis did not exist, these people will have a greater ability to explore their preferences. Maybe they will start their own business. Maybe they will just go out and work, right? Maybe they will just go to university education anyways because they genuinely just want to further their education and learn more and be enriched by knowledge. But the ability to explore your preferences are very restricted because the emphasis says that some of these preferences are more valid than others. That the university education and the university qualifications are the important thing, right? They are the preferences that society emphasizes. And then everything else, therefore, seems like an illegitimate preference that people feel afraid to explore, especially when you are a very young person, right? The decision to enter university or not happens at quite like a young age of around like 18 or 19. And when you have the society telling you that this is something that's important, it's very hard for you therefore to consider other things legitimately, like going out to start a job, maybe starting a small business, maybe taking a gap year and not going to university just to reflect on life. All of these preferences seem less important when juxtaposed against the social emphasis that university qualifications are extremely important. So that is the first thing to consider. Um, the next thing is, how does this affect people who are currently in university? So after they've been coerced to enter university, after they've been pressured to enter university, this narrative still continues to affect them, right? The emphasis doesn't go away, it's still there. So maybe this creates a lot of maybe one thing you could consider is that because people see university qualifications as the penultimate thing they need to achieve once they're in university and they have a route to the degree secured, they don't really consider other options. They don't consider building work experience. They don't consider building soft skills or interpersonal skills because they perceive themselves as already having the thing that is incredibly important. And so everything else seems subsidiary or less important. Maybe that's one angle to consider. Another angle you can consider is that maybe this puts an immense amount of stress because once they get into university, um, they are told that it's very, very important that you get the qualification. And in order to get a qualification, you need to graduate with your degree. And so maybe this creates a kind of fear where even halfway through your degree, you might realize that this isn't something that's suited for you. Maybe you feel like this is something that's not really worth your time, but there is always this immense amount of guilt or fear of just leaving university because you're told that the qualification is the important thing. And so this builds on the argument that we were talking about previously, which is that people are unhappy, people are coerced, people feel pressured, because despite them being very miserable in university, they feel like they have to hold out for it anyways because they're told that this is something that's so greatly important to their lives. The next thing is, how about people who are not in university, right? So even though there is this narrative that emphasizes going to university, the truth is that many people still do not go to university. And so how are these people perceived? So if you have a social narrative or a social emphasis that says university education is so incredibly important, but you don't have it, you don't have this important thing, you don't have this vital thing, how does that make people feel? How does that affect the way in which we perceive them? So I think the very first real world impact of this is that it's much harder to get employed if you don't have university qualifications. It's much harder for you to get like a stable job or well-paying job, because there is this kind of discrimination, because the emphasis of university qualification exists in the mind of the employers as well. So that's the first. The second is that it does contribute to discrimination to people who are not in university, right? So people who are non-university graduates, they are seen as lacking something very important. They're seen as lacking something very vital, especially when the emphasis on university qualification also has the correlation of people being in university, being more like hardworking, being more intelligent, being more competent, right? So it's not just that society emphasizes university qualifications. There are also certain associated attributes that come along with the emphasis that society has, which is that university graduates, they are more hardworking, they are more intelligent, they're more competent, they're more driven. There is a lot of these associated attributes that we have because we think that university qualifications are important, right? It's a byproduct of the emphasis. And so if you don't have that qualification, you are perceived as not possessing those attributes because university qualifications are seen as the important thing that leads you to have those attributes, right? It's seen as a filter for people who have those attributes. People who have the attribute of being intelligent and hardworking are filtered to get the university qualification. And therefore, if you don't have the qualification, you do not have those attributes. You're not hardworking, you're not intelligent, you're not competent. So that's another very pernicious, very insidious, very unjust way in which this emphasis manifests in society, where we prejudge people who do not have a university qualification because they lack something we think that is vital, we think that's something that's important. And I think that this is perhaps something that you might find slightly relatable because the kind of concern that you hear from your teachers or your parents or your relatives or your friends if you tell them that you don't want to go to university is something that does exist in society, especially in a society like Singapore, where we greatly prioritize academic education and academic excellence, especially when we are a very academic oriented society. There is this idea that you are making a wrong decision almost if you're choosing not to go to university. But to take this argument on a deeper level, I think it's important to analyze that the society's emphasis on university qualifications also has like a hierarchical element towards it as well, which is that society doesn't just say get a university qualification or get a university degree. Society is rather specific and rather elitist with it as well. Meaning to say that society judges people with different kinds of university qualifications and compare them against one another as well. So in a world where society compares and says that the emphasis on university qualifications is something that is very important, there is also like a difference between the different kinds of university qualifications. So what I mean when I say this, I mean that there is a premium placed on certain degrees. For example, getting the university qualification of a law degree or medicine degree is seen as more prestigious and more important than perhaps getting like a non-STEM related degree. Perhaps it's not just the nature of the degree or the nature of the major. Perhaps it's also about where you get your university qualifications from. So maybe there's a stigma against like Ivy League universities versus non-Ivy League universities, and those who have an Ivy League degree are therefore seen as fulfilling this emphasis better or fulfilling it more than someone who does not have an Ivy League degree. So that is also a source of discrimination. It's a source of elitism. But also, I think very perniciously is that it affects a lot of people's self-image. And this is particularly harmful given that the reason why many people don't go to university or don't go to prestigious university is not because they're not intelligent, it's not because they're not resourceful or because they're not competent, but because of structural reasons. Either because of structural discrimination with discriminatory admission boards, maybe it's because of the cost, right? Going to university is immensely expensive, it's exorbitant. And if you come from a household that's struggling financially, you might need to start working much earlier on. Your family might not be able to afford to send you to these very prestigious universities. And so there is a bit of injustice almost with a narrative that says people who don't go to universities are lacking something important when many people are structurally locked out of being able to enter university. And when you add the social element towards this emphasis, right, which is that there is a judgment of people who don't go to university. There's a judgment of people who go to like lower tier universities almost. I don't really like to use this term, but it is a way that many people think, right? Many people put universities almost on a tier list. And so it's not enough to just get a university qualification. You need to get a socially recognized university qualification as well. So I think it's important to explore the complexities of this social emphasis, right? It's not a homogeneous emphasis that just says like, oh, all university qualifications are important, right? It's a rather elitist emphasis which says that you need to get a prestigious university qualification in a major that is recognized by society. So that is one angle to explore as well. The last angle perhaps you can think about is how does this affect employers, where there is like an overemphasis on credentials, there's an overemphasis on which university you're from, there's an overemphasis perhaps on your GPA or your CAP, whether you graduated with a first class or a second upper. There are many arguments that you can explore there. So for example, perhaps this is harmful because, as mentioned earlier, there are structural barriers that prevent people from either entering university or excelling in university. It pigeonholes people into choosing these like societal approved majors instead of exploring their own interests. Perhaps it's another consideration that you can think about. But maybe the last thing that you could think about is that university qualifications are actually like a really poor proxy for whether someone will excel at their job or not. Perhaps a lot of what's important in a job would be things like soft skills, willingness to learn, maybe how well you work in a team. And a lot of these things are not assessed or measured by using the proxy of university credentials or university qualifications. So those are some of the things that you can consider on Gov. Just to summarize really quickly before we talk about the opposition case, is that the first thing that we probably want to think about is how does this affect decision making? So this leads to coercion, this leads to the inability to explore different preferences, this leads to the inability to properly assess whether university is meant for you. The second thing that we can think about is how does this affect people who are currently in university? So perhaps there's like a dual effect that we want to explore. Maybe for some people, it leads to complacency, where they already feel like they have achieved the important thing. Perhaps for some people, it leads to stress, where it creates this kind of sunk cost, where they know that university is not meant for them, but they just follow this route and they follow this path anyways because they're told that it's so important. The next thing that we want to think about, just very quickly to conclude, is that from like it's just logistically infeasible for the entire population to enter university and get a university education. The truth is that the bulk of people will be left out and unable to access prestigious university education, right? Only a minority of people fulfill this very prestigious university qualification criteria that society has. And so what happens to everyone else? How do they view themselves and how does society view them is another question that we can consider. So just to very quickly wrap up, do the outcomes benefit a certain group and disadvantage a certain group, right? So the narrative or the emphasis that having a prestigious university education and qualification is important obviously benefits people if you have like the ability to get a legacy admission, if you're an Ivy League university, if you're able to study a very prestigious course. Of course, it benefits you, right? Because you are the ideal student or the ideal citizen that the emphasis is talking about. And maybe the other important thing is to explore the counterfactual. So if you've noticed everything that we talked about previously, or the majority of what we talked about previously, is mostly criticizing the outcomes of this emphasis, right? We're saying this emphasis leads to coercion, we're saying this emphasis leads to discrimination, we're saying this emphasis leads to complacency, right? A lot of this is very negative in nature. We're saying that this leads to certain problems, it leads to certain harms. But we have yet to construct the counterfactual on government, which is that without this emphasis, what would it look like? So perhaps we'll start with rather simple construction on what this new world would look like. So the first is that university qualifications would be maybe something that is still considered, but it will be considered in a basket of other things that people consider, right? So perhaps they'll look at your job experience, your portfolio, they'll look at your personality. But the problem is that right now, because there is an emphasis, people might look at those things, but they are hugely overshadowed by your university qualification, which university you're from, and what major you're studying. So that's the first thing you could consider, right? Like perhaps in a world where there isn't this emphasis, it will allow employers and teachers and parents to be a lot more clear-minded and holistic in the way that they're evaluating people. That's one counterfactual to explore. The second is what I mentioned earlier, or what I alluded to earlier, which is that the ability to explore your preferences, the ability for you to properly evaluate and fairly adjudicate all of the different options that you have in life is much easier. It's much easier for you to enter this decision with a much clearer mind. Because right now, when people are evaluating their option after JC or poly, where they are thinking about whether they want to go to university or whether they want to go to start a job, like start working, many people will just lean in favor of university anyways because the societal emphasis just bears so heavily in their mind, right? When they talk to their parents, when they talk about when they talk to their teachers, and they talk to their friends, they're all pressuring them to go to university. Without this emphasis, that pressure wouldn't exist, which means you can properly explore which preferences are meant for you. Maybe on a deeper level, right? We can also think about the way in which our society is constructed. If you think about the way that our education system is constructed, specifically for the junior college route, it's almost like a pipeline to university where the expected um decision to make after that is to go to a university of sorts. And this is not by chance, right? This pipeline of going to like junior college or high school and then going to university is quite a deliberate um creation of society. And so perhaps in a world where university education was seen as more optional, where it was seen as less important, when it was seen as more trivial, this pipeline wouldn't exist, which means that it'll be much easier for people to just do different things after um after university, which seems like a much better narrative to have, since that actually the majority of people, especially if you're looking at people who go to polytechnic, just go and work afterwards. They just go and start a job afterwards. So the the narrative that allows people to do that more easily would be much more attuned to what people are already doing anyways, right? So just to re-explain very quickly, a lot of people, just because there are limited slots in universities, have to start work after their high school or their polytechnic period anyways. But right now the narrative tells them, oh, you're doing something that's less important, right? You are not doing the thing that we are emphasizing. You're not doing the thing that we think is important. And so this ultimately leads to a lot of discrimination, it leads to a lot of stigmatization, it causes a lot of doubt, it hurts self-image. These are all internalized with the people that don't go to university. And that doesn't change. So in a world where society didn't have this emphasis, we could imagine that society would reorient itself. A lot of the structures that we have in place that builds that pipeline from junior college to university is because we think that university is an important end goal. In a world where there wasn't this emphasis, this pipeline perhaps wouldn't be so deliberately constructed by our governments. And so it'll be much easier for people to explore different things, right? We wouldn't be almost force-fed into this route of just like going to university afterwards. So those are the things that you can consider on government. Yes. Now let's talk about things to consider on the opposition. Okay, so if you realize here, I'm asking very similar questions to what I asked on government. And the reason for this is that this is actually a clash, right? Like the government says that this is one way in which people are affected. The opposition team claims this is another way people are affected. That creates a clash point in the debate. It's very important to ensure that you're on clash, to ensure that you are engaging with your opponents, especially in 3v3, where engagement is super important. It's also important for you to think about whether your arguments are clashing with them, right? Like, is my argument going to dispute a claim that they are going to make? So one of the first things you could think about is motivation. So university education, you could talk about how this allows people to explore a lot more topics in depth, how a lot of education before just covers very basic things. It doesn't really go into much detail. There's not a lot of real world application. It's very theoretical. It's a lot of route learning. Maybe you could characterize pre-university education as that, right? It just equips you with perhaps like the more basic skills, but there isn't a lot of real world application. And university is the place where you explore education on a much deeper level, where you're more engaged, where you're more involved, where you have more autonomy and agency over your learning. That's what happens in university. That doesn't happen at a high school level or pre-university level, where it's mostly marking, it's mostly route learning, it's mostly memorization. And so, given that university does provide that very strong enrichment value to people's lives, there is a need to motivate people to go to university, right? Given that there are many barriers to entering university, like the financial costs, but not just the financial costs, but the academic requirements, right? These are barriers to enter university. If people did not think it was important, if this was not emphasized, then perhaps less people will go to university, right? People will just choose the easier option, which is just like, oh, don't really perform that well for your national exam and then just go and start work afterwards. So perhaps this motivation is important. But this argument can't just stop at saying we motivate people to go to university. We need to explain why is it important for us to motivate people to why is it important for us to motivate people to enter university, right? And in order for us to think about the impact, perhaps you want to think about who are the people that truly benefit from university education. So perhaps some groups of people who are perhaps marginalized or disenfranchised or discriminated in society need this university qualification to kind of prove themselves and break stereotypes. So if you are an employer and you are employing, choosing between a racial majority and a racial minority candidate, your subconscious bias or your explicit bias might lean in favor of the racial majority. But in a world where there are university qualifications, which is like a tangible measurement of competency, a recognized measurement of intelligence and hard work, right? It's proof that you are someone who is capable and competent. This allows us to bypass certain biases, right? That's perhaps one thing, which is it kind of overrides the stereotypes and discrimination people have by showing that you are able to do this thing. In a world where people weren't pushed to enter university, people wouldn't have this tool to leverage over these perhaps biased employers. But maybe on a more practical level, it equips us with the ability to do things like blind interviews and blind admissions, right? Because the only way in which we could do such things, one of the main ways in which we can do such things, is by just looking at their qualifications instead. And without university qualifications, a lot of these other qualifications might be a bit more ambiguous and like less certain. But the thing about university qualifications is that they are recognized, right? It's almost like a proxy where because they trust the university, they trust that the students from the university have certain talents and competencies. Without this university as a proxy, because they don't get the qualifications anymore, it's unclear that the other proxies would be reliable to prove that you are someone that's competent and worthy of the job. And maybe we'll talk about this on a more deeper level. The other things that people might look at might lean in favor of certain privileged groups. So if people look at like charisma, for example, confidence, for example, it might lean in favor of men. If people look at things like your internship experience or your job experience, it might lean in favor of people with that kind of connections and industry connections, company connections, who are able to secure those internships. So university qualifications, therefore, is a form of equalization, and we need the emphasis to motivate people to enter it, given that there are existing high barriers that would discourage and demotivate people from entering it. So the way that this argument is being framed is that there are many disincentives to enter university now because it's expensive, because it's difficult, because it's tiring. And therefore, the emphasis is a countervailing force to encourage people to enter university in spite of all of those disincentives, because university education is important for all of the outcomes that I described earlier. So that is one way in which you can frame the argument. That's one way in which you can angle the argument. You can think about how employers would default to other more biased, more racist, more sexist metrics to assess candidates in the absence of having university qualifications as a form of equalization. But the next thing we can also think about is perhaps responding to the argument we mentioned earlier from government. So if you're an opposition team preparing this motion, definitely one of the things that you should preempt is the argument that we discussed earlier, which is that this emphasis does lead to the stigmatization of people who are not in university. So perhaps one of the mitigations that you can have to this is that because we think that university is important, because society emphasizes it, there is an incentive to increase access towards it. Because we think of it as something that's important that people ought to have access to. That's why we do things like affirmative action in universities. That's why we do things like having scholarships and bursaries to help less advantaged people to enter universities. That's why we care about representation at a university level, to ensure that admissions boards are not biased, to ensure that we are giving the subsidies and the bursaries to the people who need it the most. If you think about the motivation behind all of these social efforts, if you think about the motivation behind all of these social policies, it is grounded in this belief that university is important, right? Because if university wasn't important, it wouldn't matter that people can't access it, right? It wouldn't matter that people are not represented there, right? You just be seen as an optional thing, like a trivial thing, right? Like, yeah, it doesn't matter, just go and work instead. But the fact of the matter is that on either side, the curriculum remains the same, right? The ability to gain new skills, the ability to meet a diverse group of people, the ability for you to gain a deeper understanding of the world and explore different ideologies and the different realms of knowledge. Those features of university remain the same. But in one world, people think it's important. In the other world, people don't think it's important. And in the world where people don't think it's important, there isn't this social push to ensure that access is maximized, that all different people could enter it, regardless of your social economic background, regardless of your racial background, regardless of your gender. So in a world where people did not think university education was important, university should still exist, but perhaps we'll see a lot more privileged people in universities because those are the people, they have the time, they have the money, in order for us, or in order for them, to get to universities. So that's a way that you can kind of respond to this point, from the government about people who are discriminated, and not allowed to enter university. Uh, yes. Okay, so that concludes my thoughts about the opposition case. So just to conclude very quickly about my thoughts on this debate, I do think that this is a very interesting motion. I think it's particularly relatable, especially if you are in like the pre-university part of your life where you're considering whether you want to go to university or whether you want to do something else. I think we undoubtedly feel the social emphasis in one way or another, right? We either feel it explicitly in the conversations we have with our parents, with our teachers, with our friends, or perhaps we feel it more subtly, like it's a very subtle nudge in the decisions that we make in our life, or perhaps it's just like a false consciousness where we're not even aware of it, we're not even aware that we think that this is such an important thing. It's almost normalized to us, right? It's almost expected that we just go to universities anyway. I think one of the more important takeaways for this debate is not really the outcomes or the arguments that I've discussed. I think one of the most important things to think about is the way in which you approach debates about emphasis or debates about narratives, which is that a lot of times we first need to think about the ways in which this emphasis manifests, the ways it manifests in conversations, right? The ways it manifests in norm creation. Those are very important things for us to think about because those things are the things that lead to the outcomes. And also, I think when thinking about social narratives and emphasis, it's very important for us to involve an element of realism in it, which is that these things that we're debating about do exist in the real world. This social emphasis does exist in our society, um, and in our communities. And then it's very important for us to have like an honest reflection on the nature of this emphasis. So as I mentioned earlier, right, like perhaps this is not a benign emphasis that just says, oh, you should go to university education because it's good for you. Perhaps there is an elitist element to this emphasis as well, which says that university graduates are better almost because they have this important thing, right? They have the important qualification. So if you don't have it, you are less important, you're less worthy, you're less competent. So those are my concluding thoughts and remarks about the motion. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you very much for listening to me discuss this motion. For the duration of the time that I've talked about it. And yes, I will see you next time, maybe.